tough. But there's Jody. We can read this.
All right, it looks like we have participants pretty much all in. So great. Sorry, let me. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the 10th anniversary of Loving Lampposts. My name is Noor. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And I am going to be your moderator for tonight. All right, so just to kind of give folks a brief overview of what to expect from the panel, what we are looking at here is basically reflecting on the history of the neurodiversity movement and kind of what things were like 10 years ago when the film was made versus what things are like now and where we're going in the future. We have a great panel today, including Todd Dresner, who is behind the original film. We have Carol Greenberg, who is with Thinking Person's Guide to Autism. We have DJ, who is behind the film Deej. And we have, sorry, just lost my train of thought there. And we have Lydia XZ Brown, who is with AWN, the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network. So we will go ahead and just kind of roll into things. Starting with our first question, which I'm going to start by directing at Todd. And the question is, speaking broadly, what kind of changes have we seen in the neurodiversity movement in the last 10 years since the film came out? And please pardon me, but if folks who are not speaking could please mute themselves to limit the amount of background noise, that would be really helpful.
Well, hi everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks for signing up to watch the 10th anniversary edition of the film. I watched the film for the first time in a long time recently. You know, among the changes I noticed, that probably is not what the question is about, are how deep my son's voice has gotten in the past 10 years. But looking a little more broadly than that, to me, one of the biggest things that changed is that there's, I think, a much larger recognition of intersectionality and the connection between the autistic civil rights movement and other sorts of civil rights movements. And I think back when the film came out, the idea of neurodiversity, although it was perhaps well known in the autistic community, was not at all well known in the general public. And I think now there's a greater, I hate to use the word awareness in April, but a greater awareness of neurodiversity and also of other civil rights movements that have continued to become more prominent and gain traction. And I think that's probably all to the good in terms of, because, you know, all of us need to gain our rights for any of us to have our rights. The other thing that I noticed, of course, is that when I first started this this idea of a 10th anniversary, I thought, well, maybe the vaccine section of Loving Lampposts is not as relevant anymore. And unfortunately, I think anti-vaccine activism has morphed, as we've all seen recently. You know, the forces that are anti-science and sort of reasonableness kind of morph with the times, and whatever is happening, they find a way to adapt and continue to be a problem. So that is an unfortunate thing. But I think in general, I would say over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of progress because there's more awareness of neurodiversity, and there's more connection between the autistic civil rights movement and other civil rights movements.
For sure. Carol, how would you kind of respond to this question? So what kinds of changes have we seen in the movement in the last 10 years or so since the film came out?
Yeah, I would agree with Todd that that there's been so much change in the anti-vaxxer, on the people who we identify now as anti-vaccine, and we really have to keep up with that. It's not just about people who think that vaccines are poison and they are just anti-science. It's also communities that have, and this gets back to, of course, intersectionality, because neurodiversity is simply not neurodiversity if it's not an intersectional. That's just a fact. So communities of color, economically disadvantaged communities do not have access to the vaccine. And furthermore, even if they want access to the vaccine, they've been messed with so many times that it is perfectly reasonable to people who are suspicious of government medical programs to be suspicious of government medical programs. And so we have to be very, very careful in how we educate the general public, who educates the general public, who goes to whose houses, who broadcasts, and how they get across the message that the vaccine is safe to people, people of color in particular, for whom nothing that the government has said is safe has ever been safe.
Definitely thinking through kind of intersectional messaging and thinking through kind of negating historical trauma around these issues definitely has changed, and that conversation has gotten bigger. DJ, how would you respond to this question?
We're less parent-dependent and more adult-focused than we were in 2011. Alternatively, communicating autistics are attending college now in record numbers, and we're less isolated and focused on ourselves, more focused on the wider world. The heterogeneity, diversity, and maybe even intersectionality of the movement is becoming more visible.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. And sorry, I'm just kind of giving the captions a second to catch up. And next up, we have Lydia. How would you respond to this question?
This is Lydia. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a red collared shirt and a t-shirt from the Disability Rights Center of New Hampshire today. Can you please repeat the question for me, Nora?
Absolutely. So the question is, speaking broadly, what kind of changes have we seen in the neurodiversity movement in the last 10 years since the film came out?
This is Lydia. One change that I've personally observed is a massive growth and expansion of the autistic advocacy, activism, and organizing communities. 10 years ago, it felt like there were a handful of isolated but very small, very insular groups of autistic activists operating in different spaces, an online space with a specific organization or a meetup group. But for the most part, we all knew each other. If someone was doing neurodiversity activism, there was a good chance that we knew who that person was, or we were 2 degrees of separation away at most. Today, I don't know who all of the most prominent people are in different spaces, online or offline, doing autistic activism in the neurodiversity movement. If you asked me for a list, I wouldn't be able to give you a very good list. If you asked me who all the people are that are creating important work, that are leading organizations, that are part of different campaigns, I don't actually know. And if I flip through the pages of different zines and anthologies that have been published from different autistic activists, I probably won't recognize everybody's names anymore. And I actually think that's an amazing thing, because it means that neurodiversity no longer belongs only to a small handful of activists who mostly all know each other. And now it is a much broader, more expansive movement with all sorts of subgroups, sub-movements, different organizations, different spaces within neurodiversity, different social groups, people doing work on all these different fronts, people who in 2010, 2011 were college students or in middle school now are working in policy, have formed their own citywide autistic organization, have gotten elected to office, are in grad school, have gotten married and had kids, have done something else with their life, whether or not it is directly tied to neurodiversity. And I think that's amazing, because I want to know what the next generation is working on and where the neurodiversity movement goes next. And I am so excited and so happy to know that where it is today looks radically different than where it was 10 years ago.
And Nora, I just wanted to break in before you ask the next question. I just pasted in the chat if people needed a link to the captions, which apparently go a little faster than they go in the Zoom. So that's in the chat if anyone would like to see it. And also, Nora, I think you may not have told people what they could do if they wanted to ask a question, if you want to do that.
Oh, thank you for reminding me. So we sent this info out for folks who registered, but just in case we had any last minute signups, we are going to be accepting a couple of audience questions at the end. And if you would like to submit a question, the way that you can do that is by emailing info@autisticadvocacy.org with the subject line "Loving Lampposts," and then put your question in the body of the email. We do have someone monitoring that and compiling questions, so that will be available for us once we get through the questions we planned ahead of time. So that way, that'll be there right at the end. I would ask that folks who want to submit questions try to do so kind of within the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, just so that there's enough time for us to compile and kind of leave time for any errors, what have you. So yeah, that is an option. So once again, for anyone who missed the info at the beginning, that's going to be info@autisticadvocacy.org with any questions using the subject line "Loving Lampposts." All right, great. So next up, we have another question. So we've kind of touched on some of the big growth and changes that have happened within the movement in the past decade. So one thing that is interesting to think about too is kind of what hasn't changed and why do you think that is? So I think we'll go ahead and start with Carol.
Yeah, I think I'm a good person to ask about that, because I am not only autistic myself, but I am also the mother of an autistic teen, partially speaking autistic teen. So he and I present rather differently. I'm obviously fully speaking, can't shut up much, autistic 57-year-old white woman, Jewish white woman, and I have an 18-year-old white son who, nonetheless, he and I experience things very different, experience a lot of things very differently, but yet also do have the same condition and also do have a lot of similar experiences. And one of the things that unfortunately hasn't changed is that when people come to me and they want me to talk about autism, they really want to talk to me about my son. And they don't really want to talk to me much about me. And one thing that has remained the same that has to change as soon as humanly possible is this whole notion of transition, meaning transition from school age, high school age into adult life. That's not the meaning of transition we need. We need a total life cycle transition outlook, and our research in autism has to reflect that. So what is the difference between a transition from school age to adulthood? What is the transition from early adulthood to mid-adulthood, when you're really building your career or whatever it is that you will be devoting yourself to? What is the transition to middle age, and then from middle age to becoming an elder? I'm 57 years old. I'm starting to age into the elder group. My father was almost 93 when he died. He was autistic. And what his needs were, I had a sense of them, but the research hasn't been done on that group at all, practically. There's a little bit, it still has to be independently replicated. That's very worrisome. That hasn't changed. We're pushing for a lot of the autistic elders at conferences like International Autism Research Conference are pushing for much more research, particularly on middle-aged to elder autistics. And of course, there needs to be much more research on underserved communities. And I'm not talking about coronavirus here. I'm talking about totally underserved communities in terms of educational services, transition to work services, Medicaid services, all of that. People of color, lower income people, women are generally ignored. Certainly trans people, gay people, people who are non-binary are underserved and discriminated against across the board. That hasn't changed.
Definitely. Thank you for talking about that, and about the fact that like the research numbers and the research funding haven't really shifted super meaningfully in terms of what we study and how much we study autistic adults. That's definitely something to think about. Next up, we have DJ.
Despite more and more higher education institutions opening their doors, most kindergarten through 12th grade public schools still segregate autistics in classrooms of easy lessons. I think funding formulas and teacher training programs hold these archaic practices in place. I also think the notion of inclusion is problematic because it necessitates the exclusion of others. I think we need to move beyond inclusion and give teachers training in different pathways to teaching reading and writing, rather than instruction in managing behavior. And for the most part, mainstream marketing still hasn't moved beyond the miraculous, overcoming narrative model. How many so-called exceptions can there be before the center does not hold?
Thank you. So definitely a lot of aspects of education haven't shifted. Next up, we have Lydia. So how would you approach the question of what hasn't changed in the last 10 years, and why do you think that is?
Many more autistic people of color and autistic queer and trans people are very out and proud and talking about the intersections of race and gender and sexuality in our lives in public ways than we were 10 years ago, in ways where we are actually offered some platform to do that. But discourse and advocacy and research and policymaking related to autism remains dominated overwhelmingly by white autistic people, by cisgender autistic people, by straight autistic people. Autistic people of color remain erased, forgotten, excluded, deliberately deprived of and denied access to the same opportunities and spaces for support, for recognition, for a platform compared to white autistic people. And you can see this anywhere you go. If you look at who is most likely to be able to get into graduate school to study autism from a neurodiversity perspective, more likely white autistic people will be able to do that than autistic people of color. If you look at who the leaders are of most self-advocacy organizations nationally, most of the leaders of self-advocacy organizations in senior executive or management roles are white autistic people. If you look at who is able to receive public recognition, the majority, whether they are definitely within the neurodiversity movement or they're not, and we know which autistic people I mean, tend to be white autistic people. And I think what's changed is that there is more superficial understanding and recognition of the fact that racism is alive, real, and pervasive within the autistic and broader disabled advocacy communities. But what hasn't changed is the actual structures and institutions, systems, and patterns of that racism.
Absolutely. So we definitely still have those entrenched power structures and that inherent leadership being centered around white people within the autistic community. Absolutely. All right, so for the next question, we have whose opinions and thoughts are at the center of the conversation when someone is being introduced to autism as a part of their life or their family member's life, and is that different now than it was a decade ago? Let's go ahead and start with Carol for this one.
Okay, it's usually white parents like me. It's usually not autistic parents like me. So in other words, parents are still being asked the questions about their kids rather than the autistic people themselves. And it so happens that I am autistic, and so sometimes I get the questions about being autistic, but generally it's through the filter of, oh, you have an autistic kid like I do. Your experience must be like mine. Not really, not so much.
Absolutely, thank you for sharing that. Next up, we have DJ.
I'd like to think it's our voices. I try to encourage all parents and professionals to read our words and watch our films, but I think we have a long way to go still. Hopefully ASAN Start Here manual and communication first short film listen are reaching broader audiences.
Thank you, absolutely. So again, we come back to the trend of listening to parents over autistic people and the need to recenter autistic voices. Lydia, how would you answer the question of whose thoughts and opinions are at the center of the conversation when autism is introduced as a part of someone's life or a family member's life? And is that different now than it was a decade ago?
The question of whose thoughts are centered and whose thoughts should be centered are very different questions. Whose thoughts are centered? Everybody except the autistic person. Whose thoughts should be centered? The person who is actually autistic. Now, it is common, as in Carol's family, and she was sharing just a little while ago, for many of us to be part of multiple generations of autistic people in the same family. It's not necessarily as common for multiple generations to know that they are autistic for a variety of reasons related to race, related to age, related to gender, and even related to what we know and understand about autism now versus what was known about autism 20, 40, 60, or 80 years ago. And what has not changed, and Carol said this already, is that when most people talk about autism, they assume that whoever the autistic person is in the conversation is definitely incompetent, incapable of having or expressing ideas, opinions, desires, or preferences, certainly not capable of evaluating or assessing anything about their own life or their own needs, and presumed incapable of ever being able to participate in the conversation, or to the extent that they might, that this will only be done in a tokenizing and patronizing way. In the, oh, so we want to know, what does Ben want to say about his life? What does Junho want to say about his life? What does Kartik want to say about his life? Oh, that's really nice. We're so glad that you shared. Okay, so can you tell us about what Kartik is actually interested in? Question immediately being turned to someone who is not Kartik, for example. And that remains true no matter who we are. So for me, someone who is a policy professional and expert, who is a lawyer, who spends some time actually representing disabled clients, it is horrifying but entirely unsurprising that all the time people will ask me in public, oh, what do you do? And if I tell them I do work related to autism or disability, they will immediately follow up with, oh, so do you have a child? Do you know someone who has a child? And there's this presumption that anyone who's autistic could never be doing anything other than, I guess, existing as a glorified object in a corner somewhere, ever. And we know that no matter what somebody's support needs, even if someone never goes to college, they never have a full-time job, they never have a career, that all autistic people have perspectives, that all autistic people have agency, that autistic people understand when other people are talking about us. Even if a particular autistic person may not understand all the words that someone else is using, we can tell if somebody is being patronizing or condescending or assumes that we're not really there. And that can happen to any of us for any number of reasons. And I find it angering too, because if I say, oh, well, I'm autistic, the people who will say those comments to me will always respond by saying things like, oh, wow, I never would have guessed. Wow, what was it like for your parents? And I'm like, okay, this conversation is over. And usually these conversations are taking place, unfortunately, on planes pre-pandemic, because I'm incapable of not trying to start a conversation due to social expectations of trying to talk to people. And I can't leave because now I'm stuck on this plane at 35,000 feet in the air and there's nowhere to go. And this person's just like, so what was it like for your parents? What does it mean to have autism? You must be very, very high functioning. You shouldn't call yourself disabled. You're so smart and articulate. And I'm like, okay, so you have just revealed to me that you believe that autism is mutually incompatible with personhood. You just revealed that to me. You told on yourself. You confessed to me what you actually think. So that has not changed. People always assume that if the conversation is about autism, the feelings and ideas that are centered are of literally everybody who isn't the actual autistic person. Anyone else but us.
Yep, absolutely. And that is a very powerful summary of kind of this reality that we're all faced with, that so frequently we are just looked past and spoken over. It is a lot. Our next question is that Autism Acceptance Month is all about celebrating, not separating, our community. What's one aspect of our community's history that you think is important that people know about? And let's go ahead and start with Carol.
Well, I hear a lot less talk this year, in particular about lighting it up blue. And I have a joke every single year, but I never get tired of it. So if I lit myself up blue, I just look like an autistic Smurf. I mean, I seriously do not appreciate all of the money, all of the time, all of the effort that could be better spent improving the quality of my life or my dad's life or my son's life being spent on performative awareness or even performative acceptance. If you really accept autistic people, that would be reflected in policy and funding. Let's see it. I'm not seeing it yet. And to tag on to something that Lydia was saying, it's all about the people surrounding the autistic person, not the autistic person themselves, I get a lot of stuff about what we call at Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, the not like my child syndrome. Those of us who are speaking autistics like me, who generally can speak until an emergency happens, a fire alarm goes off, and I'm one fire alarm away from losing all of my language for a few minutes, and then I eventually regain it. But my son is most of the time doesn't have a lot of expressive spoken language. However, he writes, he draws, he paints, he uses his entire body to communicate. I always know what he wants. He always makes that clear. I always know what he doesn't want. He always makes that clear. He's as opinionated as I am, thank God. And he, you know, he doesn't hold back. It wouldn't occur to him to, because everybody in our home, at least, has always treated him like a full human being, deserving of respect. So when people tell me I am not like their child, what they're actually saying to me is something unbelievably insulting, that I'm not like my child. I'm a lot like my child. There are some differences in the way we experience the day-to-day world, but I'm a lot like my child, except that he's better at a lot of things than I am. I talk good, and that's about it. He can do all the other stuff. He taught me how to put my shoes on the right feet. He taught me how to ride an escalator. I never had any intervention. He had some useful education that was respectful, because he demanded it. Basically, he wouldn't pay attention if somebody didn't treat him with respect. So there are only a few teachers at his school who are allowed to work with him, because most of them, he just, you know, yanks their chain, which is good.
Absolutely. So definitely reflecting on the fact that the whole trend of people assuming that autistic people who are within kind of quote unquote like the broader advocacy field can't possibly be like their child is definitely a historical trend, and it's one that sucks. But it's interesting to hear that that there is like kind of windows opening in some places in terms of education, in terms of having the ability to demand respect and to continue getting what you need.
They're being pushed open by autistic people. Very
Accurate.
Autistic people who are not themselves speaking people. They're still being pushed open.
Oh, absolutely.
Because advocacy looks like all kinds of different things. If you know how to listen to autistic people who don't use spoken language, then you're going to learn a lot. But it's on you as a speaking person, whether you're autistic or not, it's on speaking people to learn how to listen to non-speaking people.
Absolutely. All right, next up we have DJ. How would you approach this question?
So you asked what's one aspect of our community's history that you think is important that people know about. I do love when we sang the Autism Speaks and the Yale Child Development ad campaigns in 2009. And when Mel Bags posted their video on my language in 2007. And when Autistics and Fresh Thinking Allies came together to write the first special edition of a journal on neurodiversity published by ESQ in 2010. And Tito's appearance on 60 Minutes early in the first decade of this century.
Awesome. Thank you for pointing out some of those landmarks. Next up, we've got Lydia. So how would you approach kind of telling us about one aspect of our community's history that you think is important for people to know about?
It's really hard to try to limit it to just one.
That's fair enough.
I didn't think a lot about this question. I probably should have. I would I wish that more people knew that things that many people now might think of as history are not over. Not just the kind of trends that we're talking about, like the ways in which ableism shows up, but things like eugenics and institutionalization. Many of us who are here now might be aware that eugenics is very much alive and real, that institutions continue to exist. But I don't think enough people know about that. I don't think enough people realize that eugenics is widespread, commonplace, part of our law and policy. I don't think enough people are aware that institutionalization remains common and that not all institutions look like large Willowbrooks or Pennhursts or the kind of places where thousands of people might be living in a single site. Although some such institutions continue to exist, people don't realize that the Judge Rotenberg Center, someone mentioned it in the chat, is still open and shocking people as punishment. People don't realize that that remains actually legal to do. People don't realize that disabled people can still be sterilized sometimes, with or without spuriously, not spurious, with or without suspect contained, I'm losing the ability to talk today, with or without supposedly having obtained consent. That's what I'm trying to say. And like words are like not happy. You know what? This is like a mostly autistic room. You understand. It's fine. This has been a long day, a long week, a long fucking year, if not longer than that. And my ability to communicate is highly contingent upon how much chocolate I have. Oh, chocolate. I'm gonna consume some. I wish people understood and knew that those things we like to think of as history are not over. And if we don't understand what our histories have been, we have little to no hope of being able to challenge or end those practices in the future, let alone to think about what our world will look like without them, what it will look like if we are not currently having to fear what will happen if someone tries to file a guardianship petition, what will happen if somebody tries to take our children, what will happen if somebody decides during a particular day to call the police because they mistake existing in the world that is hostile, violent, dangerous, and scary for us being the danger or the threat, especially amplified for Black and Brown autistic people as a danger. And we need to know and to understand exactly what our history has been so that we can organize and advocate more strategically for our future, to be more effective in building that future to come.
Absolutely. You're right, a lot of history is still ongoing, is still being made, and still needs to come to an end, unfortunately. Okay, so next up we have, where do you think our movement needs to go right now and in the future to make the world better for all autistic people? Let's go ahead and start with Carol.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, absolutely. Where do you think our movement needs to go right now and in the future to make the world better for all autistic people?
For me, personally, because I've been so involved as a community in the community advisory committee for the International Autism Research Conference. It all starts with research. So if the researchers are not autistic, and most of them are not, or if they are, they're hiding it because it would be held against them. They're afraid to come out. If the researchers are not openly autistic, there's probably a bias against autistics. And even the most well-educated, supposedly well-educated, well-trained teachers and administrators of schools are basing their programs upon research that is faulty or biased because the researchers are asking the wrong questions or asking questions in a way that autistics can't comprehend them and answer them that is truly reflective of autistic experience, then the training that is based upon the flawed research will also be flawed. If the training is flawed, then the people who are extremely well trained in fundamentally flawed training are going to be teaching the wrong things in the wrong ways and focusing on the wrong ways. And then that filters down to the kids or the adults, especially in congregate facilities like Lydia was talking about institutions. Nowadays, there's a move in institutionalization towards smaller institutions. Some of those are basically what we call group homes. Some of those are institutions. So in congregate facilities, you have even autistic adults being treated like prisoners and it all goes back to the research about who we are and what autism is and what autism could never be. So it goes all the way back. There's this whole chain that has to change from the very beginning. We need more openly autistic researchers, and we need them listened to, really listened to, not tokenized.
Absolutely. DJ, how would you respond to this question?
I'm all for using charism as approach to activism. If autism speaks pruned and centralized parent and professional advocacy, we do well to flourish as a decentralized network of interconnected, interdependent resources. I have a fear of segregated activism. I'd love for us to move beyond inclusion and independence and continue to focus on interdependence and self-efficacy. I think we all need to add our life stories to the Lives in Progress project and offer hopeful, diverse, culturally sensitive pathways for others to learn from. Our strength is in our diversity. We need to promote and nourish it.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Next up, we have Lydia. Where do you think our movement needs to go right now and in the future to make the world better for all autistic people?
The neurodiversity movement needs to be grounded, rooted in, and informed by disability justice. There are many neurodiversity advocates who are already doing that work, but not enough of us are in that space. Neurodiversity without disability justice runs the risk of turning into another ableist movement, of maintaining and upholding its structural racism, of maintaining and upholding patriarchal norms and classist expectations for whose needs we are actually fighting for what it is that we are doing. Disability justice as a framework was co-created by Black and Brown disabled people and queer and trans disabled people and queer and trans disabled people of color. And disability justice requires us to embrace and to work from and toward values and principles like intersectionality, cross-community solidarity, cross-disability organizing and solidarity work, and interdependence. Now, interdependence is already deeply embedded as a value of the neurodiversity movement and always has been. In the ways that we've organized our activism and our advocacy, how we organize autistic community spaces. But the other values and principles of disability justice, as outlined by Patricia Byrne and Aurora Levins Morales and others, are not norms in the neurodiversity movement. They have not been norms in the neurodiversity movement. The voices and the representatives and the leaders of neurodiversity and neurodiversity organizations and campaigns and spaces still continue to be overwhelmingly white, still continue to be overwhelmingly class privileged, still continue to be people who are perceived as respectable. And I want to be clear too, sometimes that's me. I'm here as somebody who is multiply marginalized in many different ways for many different reasons. Yes? I'm also here as somebody who moves through the world with access to a lot of different forms of privilege. And many of us do. Just by being here right now, we all have two forms of privilege automatically. One is we're all able to communicate in or understand some form of English, spoken or written. And another is we all have internet access. Those are types of privilege that not everybody has, including many disabled people, including many autistic people who are multiply marginalized, who are currently institutionalized, who are actively deprived of basic means of accessing health and safety and freedom as defined by us on our own terms. Our movement needs to ground itself in disability justice and to learn from autistic people who are already doing that work. People like Leah Lakshmi Pyapshna Samara Singha, Talila Lewis, Saray Jarrell Johnson, Dorian Taylor, many others who are out there on the front lines doing path-breaking work for disability justice. That's where the neurodiversity movement needs to be.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And that actually ties well into what will probably be our last question, since we have about 10 minutes remaining in the time, which Lydia did us a great justice in naming a whole bunch of disabled people that they value and celebrate. So let's narrow the scope a little bit and talk about who are some autistic people in specific that you value and celebrate that are either living or that have passed on. Let's go ahead and start with Carol.
You'll have to bear with me here if I get weepy, but my father was the first, we didn't know it at the time, but my father was the first autistic I ever met. And he was the one who taught me so much about being autistic in a world that wasn't welcoming to us. I've said this online. He just died in December. He hadn't used spoken language for about 3 years before his death because he had aphasia and severe aphasia and apraxia. And I was the only one who could communicate with him effectively because everybody else around him assumed that he was incapable and had dementia, and he was almost 93. He didn't. And he was able to tell me, he was able to communicate to me with no words that some of his symptoms that he thought that they were indicative of an underlying physical condition, and that it was very significant and that I had to talk to his doctors, all without speech or writing. So he was an amazing man. And one of the things he used to say to me, and that I keep saying to people online, because people are always coming to me about advice and how do I parent an autistic child? And his words to me always come to mind. So I would come home and I would say, all the kids in school were bullying me. They say I'm wrong. They say I'm weird. And he would often say to me, you really need to consider the possibility that all of them are wrong and you are right. And it was that kind of talk whispered in my ear and said to me over and over and over again throughout my childhood that made me able to advocate for myself and then other people, and that made me able to raise an autistic son who, despite the fact that, you know, he has significantly more trouble communicating in a way that people are willing to listen to. It was my dad's example that helped me learn how to parent an autistic son. So that is the autistic person I admire.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And may his memory be a blessing. DJ, who are some autistic people that you value and celebrate, either living or passed on?
There are too many to mention here. I value and celebrate Jamie Burke, Sue Rubin, Julia Bascom. Jamie is, I think, the bravest person I have ever met. He showed us learning to talk shouldn't be discarded by the time someone is 5. Julia Bascom is my favorite because I find her to be my only massively helpful speaking autistic friend, and we share a belief that a Rismler's approach will make it impossible to weed us out. And Sue Rubin, who started the run of many of us alternatively communicating people to go to college and university. I also value and celebrate Tino Makhopehaye, whose writings are nothing short of brilliant and who was the first alternatively communicating person to write a book and appear on national television. Mel Baggs, who gave me the courage to become a national activist and expand my understanding of language. Dawn Prince, her article in a Neurodiversity in DSQ called The Silence Between, an autoethnographic examination of the language prejudice and its impact on the assessment of autistic and animal intelligence, and her work as an anthropologist convinced me to ask not what anthropology can do for autistics, but what autistics can do for anthropology. And Donna Williams, who made it possible to have sensory issues, exposure anxiety, and be a fantastic artist and writer. I love her a lot. But honestly, I value and celebrate every single one of us. Hope lives on, messy and imperfect, because each of us is making our way through the world.
Thank you so much for sharing that, DJ. And Lydia was kind enough to share in the chat that the folks that they mentioned previously are all autistic people of color that they admire. Lydia, if you would like to share those names again, you're welcome to, or if you would prefer to skip since you've already shared that information, either is completely fine with me.
I did share some names and I realized my brain is clearly in the LOL, what are words and things mode. I didn't spell that for the captioner, so I can do that. I said the names Leah, Leah, Lakshmi, Lakhshmi, Piepzna, Piepzna hyphen SAMARASINHA. The captioner has it and typed it, and I put it in the chat. The second name I mentioned was Talila, Talila, Lewis, Lewis. And the last name that I mentioned was Saree, Cyree, Jarell, Jarelle, Johnson. And I did mention a fourth name, I realized that. I said Dorian, Dorian, Taylor, Taylor. Those are some people who are doing path-breaking work now. I also want to uplift people who've been doing work since before the modern neurodiversity movement took its full form. People like Laura Tisonchik, Tisonchik, and Cal Montgomery, Cal Montgomery, whose name I saw somebody else also lifted up in the chat. And just as importantly, I want to lift up the people who don't have big names, who don't write blogs, who don't hold leadership positions in organizations or serve on boards of directors, who do not appear on the news, who are not in documentaries, with all due respect to loving Lampposts, the reason we're here tonight. I want to lift up the autistic people who are working toward revolution, toward resistance, toward building the next world to come without accolade, without recognition, most of whose names many of us might never know. I want to hold space for those who've been taken from us before their time because their family members murdered them, because they died in an institution buried on unmarked graves, because they died before we knew what autism was, because they were murdered because of medical abuse and violence. For all of these reasons, I want to lift up the autistic people who might have become leaders and trailblazers in our movement and our community, were they not taken from us before they were here. I think that the work I do, and I've been saying this a lot lately, is very much informed by the Jewish value tikkun olam, Tikkun Olam. I am not Jewish, but a lot of people who are in my life are. Tikkun olam means to repair the world. The work that we do and the work that our pioneers, our ancestors, our elders have done, the work that the next generation is doing, is the work of repairing the world. How can we address the harm and violence of ableism in this world, of racism, of white supremacy, of class oppression and gender oppression, and all of the other things that inflict violence in our lives, that deprive and deny us of basic access, support, and care? How can we repair that harm while moving us toward the next world to come? And I think that a lot of that work has always already been happening in the places where we're least likely to look for it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that amazing closing thought. We are just about to hit our end time limit at 8 p.m. So I wanted to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for their thoughts and their ideas and their wisdom. I wanted to thank Todd for giving us the opportunity to, during this, the 10th anniversary of Autism Acceptance Month and the 10th anniversary of Loving Lampposts, share in community and to look back on where we've come, where we come from rather, and where we're going. So yes, for everyone who is just kind of marinating on what we've just gone through, feel free to kind of process it, take it in, and always keep learning. For those of us who are fasting, because it is Ramadan, Lydia just pointed out that it was iftar on the East Coast about 10 minutes ago. So if you want or need to break fast, that is an option at this point. So yeah, that's about it. Thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you for supporting this event. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.